In this video, we're going to look at market structure. Namely, we're going to look at imperfect competition, given that we have already examined the case of perfect competition in our supply and demand analysis. Recall the ultimate inefficiency, and that was the perfectly competitive market. In a perfectly competitive market, we have that the marginal cost, in this case it's the supply function, is equal to the marginal willingness to pay, which is our demand function. And recall that the area underneath a marginal willingness to pay curve is a total willingness to pay. So if we were to extend all of this down to zero, then the entire area under the demand function would be our total willingness to pay for Q. If, on the other hand, we have that the marginal cost intersects the marginal willingness to pay, or the marginal benefit, supply intersecting demand at this point here, Q star, P star, then we can look at what the consumer has to pay. They pay this amount given by the rectangle, and they get this consumer surplus because they're willing to pay this amount here, given by the rectangle plus that triangle at the top. The producer surplus, however, is given by the price times quantity, the revenue received by the producers, and we subtract from that the cost of production, leaving us with the producer surplus. Previously, we looked at the case where we had perfect competition, where the sum of the producer and consumer surpluses is maximized when supply and demand intersect. Anytime we are to the left or to the right of Q star, the perfectly competitive output, then the sum of those surpluses will be less than what it is if we are at Q star. Inefficiency or market failure occurs whenever the price is greater than the marginal cost. At that point, the marginal earning or benefit exceeds the cost of producing that next item. Society, therefore, will want more of the good or service because its value to society at the margin to consumers exceeds the marginal cost to society, the cost to producers. Notice, of course, that this is a value judgment, as we discussed in the introductory lecture to this course. Now, if price is less than marginal cost, the firm will always want to decrease production because the marginal benefit of production, the earning it receives, is less than what it costs to produce that item. So if the marginal cost is upward sloping, the firm will want to reduce output. If price is greater than marginal cost, it is often used as a justification for government intervention to correct this perceived market failure. The intervention cannot be justified, however, if the cost of government intervention exceeds the benefit of correcting the distortion. In that case, what we do is we risk what is called government failure. So you have two kinds of failure. You have government failure and you have market failure. And one can be worse than the other, as we will see later in this course. Now we come to monopoly, where we have a single seller. So a monopolist is the sole supplier of a good or service for which there are no close substitutes. So because the monopolist has market power, it can restrict production and thereby raise the price above marginal cost. In other words, a monopolist does not really have a supply schedule, but sets price and then supplies the quantity demanded by the market at that price. Monopolies are or can be artificially created, as is the case in Canadian supply management for dairy, poultry, and eggs, and we will see that in a later slide. Let's look at a monopolist, a single seller. The single seller looks at the demand function, and we assume a linear demand function here, and rather than setting demand equal to marginal cost at this point here, as does a perfectly competitive firm, the monopolist will set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, the marginal revenue function equal to this supply or marginal cost curve at this point QM. What is the difference? the perfectly competitive firm has marginal revenue equal to price. So this then is the marginal revenue curve facing the perfectly competitive firm. Why? Because a perfectly competitive firm is so small relative to the market that it cannot affect the price. For example, one single wheat farmer does not affect the price of wheat. Now, what happens is with the monopolist recognizes that as it sells more, its price is going to go down, and thus it creates this marginal revenue function, which turns out to be double the slope of a linear demand function. So the slope of marginal revenue is twice the slope of demand. What happens is the consumer now gets area U plus V rather than UV S and the upper part of this yellow box. So this represents the loss to the consumer. The yellow area represents the monopoly rent, if you like. What the monopolist gains, however, is over the competitive firm is this upper box, which the producer gets from the consumers, but it loses T, area T, the triangle here, as a producer surplus. It loses that. Now, this area will always be greater than T because of the way that we analyze this. But the consumers and the producers lose this S plus T. So this is partly the consumer surplus, partly the producer surplus. That's lost, and this then represents the deadweight loss to society. So that is why we, as economists, do not like monopoly for the most part. And notice that we're using the milk example here because we'll study that a little later on. Now, recall from our discussion on price elasticities that the demand function, along the demand function, the elasticity, the price elasticity of demand will change. It is perfectly elastic. In other words, the elasticity of demand is minus infinity at this point here at the top. It turns out to be the elasticity of demand is equal to -1 at this point where the marginal revenue curve intersects from above the horizontal axes, and it's perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic rather, this is a slight error here, at epsilon equals 0, in other words, where the demand function intersects the vertical curve. So then this is the inelastic portion of the demand function, and this is the elastic portion. Now you'll notice immediately that the monopolist will never operate in the inelastic portion of the demand function because marginal revenue is negative. All right, marginal revenue is negative. So unless they're required to by law, they will never operate beyond Q. We can look at this graphical structure in a bit more detail by looking at how marginal revenue looks in a competitive versus a monopolistic firm. When a competitive firm sells one more unit, it gains area B. Remember, the marginal revenue for a competitive firm is given by this horizontal demand curve because that's effectively the demand curve facing the individual firm in a competitive industry. So when it increases production by 1 unit, it gets area B and adds it to A. Now in the case of monopoly, we have a downward sloping demand curve, and remember we then as a result get a marginal revenue curve. We increase by 1 unit the amount of sales, and notice that the price then drops from P1 to P2. The area that's gained by the monopolistic firm is area B, but it loses area C. So in other words, if B is greater than C rather, then the marginal revenue is positive. If B is less than C, then the marginal revenue is less than 0. So in that case, you would not want to increase production in that particular instance. And we can see that here where the initial revenue is R1, competition gives them A plus B, and the marginal revenue is simply given by P1. In the monopolistic firm, we get A plus C is the gain, but we lose B. Revenue with one more unit is A plus B, but the marginal revenue is B minus C equals P2 minus C. So we have to take that into account. Notice that the steepness of that demand function, that linear demand function, determines these areas B and C. So in this case, a very steep demand function gives a very small increase in B and perhaps a bigger increase in C, whereas a flatter demand curve gives a bigger increase in B and a small increase in C relative to B. Now it's important to remember the following result. The monopolist never chooses Q where demand is inelastic. Why not? Well, we saw that already when the marginal revenue curve was negative. So it doesn't do so unless the profits are positive, which doesn't occur in this particular case when you're in the inelastic portion of the demand curve. Profits can be increased by operating where demand is elastic. So if you're in that inelastic demand function, then you're better off going to where demand is elastic. This is because marginal revenue equals marginal cost, maximizes profits, and marginal revenue is only positive where demand is elastic. Again, let us be clear that equilibrium is determined by the intersection of marginal revenue equals marginal cost rather than marginal cost equal price. The monopoly outcome results in the monopolistic price exceeding the marginal cost depicted here with that little c. And notice that this diagram is a bit, you can see more clearly here that this distance from 0 to MR is equal to the distance from this MR to where the demand curve intersects the horizontal axes. We now come to a more puzzling situation where we have a single buyer. So monopsonistic, and we call that monopsony. A monopsonistic firm realizes that the price they have to pay for a factor of production or for an input rises as the firm buys more. So upon doing the math, we can get the slope of the marginal outlay function, denoted MO, and that's double the supply of the linear supply function. So we also impose on that the buyer's derived demand, because when you're purchasing inputs, it's a derived demand function that you're looking at. And the derived demand function from other courses in economics is simply the value of the marginal product, in this case of uranium, in the production of, say, electricity, nuclear power. Which is equal to the price of electricity times the marginal product of uranium in producing electricity. And we call that, or we can write that as the VMP uranium in electricity. Now the area A represents a quasi-rent or producer surplus. Notice here it's a consumer surplus from the perspective of a buyer of uranium, but because that buyer is a producer of electricity, it's also a measure of the producer surplus for the power plant that can be measured in the electricity market. And we don't discuss that here, but that's basically what it is. This area A represents an area that we would then find in the market for electricity for that particular power plant. By practicing monopsony, the power plant can offer to purchase QB. All right, remember this is Q star would be the perfectly competitive output. QB is the output of a single buyer. And in that case, the buyer would pay PS instead of P star here, and or rather than PB as well, and thereby it gains that area B, C, E, F. So this rectangle here is the gain to the monopsonistic buyer. So this is the area that it gains over and above A. And compared to the perfect competition situation, the firm gains E, F minus D. All right, so you have to think about this in terms of a kind of consumer surplus, but the consumer surplus is really a producer surplus or quasi-rent for the power producer in the electricity market. Here we come to a really distorted market in the sense that we have a monopoly and a monopsonist. So this would be a firm, say, that operates in the market for cobalt as a buyer of cobalt to produce, say, electric vehicles, batteries. We may have one producer of batteries that acts as a seller of batteries in the one market as a monopolist, but a buyer of cobalt in another market as a monopsonist. So here we are looking at a situation where we have both a monopolist and a monopsonist. In that case, the amount that would be produced by the firm would not be determined solely by either this point here where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost, or this point where the marginal outlay is equal to the marginal willingness to pay, all right? But rather it's determined by the intersection of marginal revenue and marginal outlay. So what happens is the producer the price and quantity in a perfectly competitive market, the quantity would be QE and the price P star. If it was only a buyer, then the price would be B, and if it was only a seller, it would be A. But of course they'd be off here. This would be the buyer situation with this intersection, the seller situation with that. But in this case, the deadweight loss is given by this rectangle, this triangle ABE. A to here to E is this triangle is the loss to the consumers. This is the loss to the producers. This is the area that this monopoly monopsonist would collect. Now, it depends. If we have a single firm, that's where it would go. But if we had two firms, then this area, this white area, would then be shared between the two firms somehow, and that would depend on the bargaining power of the two firms. So what are some examples of monopolies? Well, internet monopolies are well known now. The largest firms in the world today are internet companies such as Facebook, Google, Amazon, Alibaba, and many growing firms are also connect different users through the internet, like Uber, Airbnb, Epic Games. These firms benefit from network externalities. So what are network externalities? A good has a network externality of one person's valuation of a good or service depends on the number of other users or consumers. So we get both a direct size effect and an indirect effect. So the direct size effect is the larger the size of an ATM network, say, the easier it is to find one. So if we have a lot of ATMs out there, it's easier to find one. The indirect effects are a chicken and egg problem. Your choice of a Mac or PC depends on available software, but software written for each type depends on the number of users. So which do we have first? Do we have the computer first and then the software, or the software and then the user, the computer? I prefer to use a PC for this same indirect effect reason. I run some software that is less available on a Mac than it is on a PC, so I use the PC version of it, which is more powerful than the Mac version. Broadband internet service was initially expensive and thus had low demand. However, so in other words, low demand implied that few services were offered. But as demand grew, more services were offered, like streaming music, able to make telephone calls across the internet, which reduced the price of using or making telephone calls. That increased demand, which resulted in more of these services, and so on. Now, many internet firms have very high fixed costs and very low marginal costs. This makes them like pharmaceutical companies. Google has huge development costs of writing software and designing new products, but the cost of providing services to users is almost zero, and it sets a price of zero to users. It's very much like a bridge. If you build a bridge, it costs a lot of money to build the bridge and get the first car across. But after that, the marginal cost of getting other cars across up until the point of congestion is essentially zero. In that case, in the Google case and in the bridge case, the average cost curve is downward sloping. So that means that you can slide down that average cost curve and reduce the per unit cost of making this available. So other firms cannot compete on price, and advertisers are thereby willing to pay a lot for Google's so-called users' eyeballs, which enable them to be higher up on the list of companies when the search engine is implemented. Okay, let's consider supply management in Canada's dairy sector. Canada uses production quotas to ensure stable and profitable returns for the dairy industry. The quota is set such that the market price provides a so-called fair return. And the quota is set in terms of butterfat. So it's the amount of butterfat in milk that's important. As a result, Canada ends up producing a little too much in the way of protein, in other words, skim milk powder, that it then has to try and get rid of on the international market, which is becoming problematic because the international market does not permit Canada to export very much skim milk powder as a result of its effort to protect the dairy industry through high import tariffs of 300% or something like that. So lobbyists argue that the prices are only marginally higher than in the US, and unlike the US, there are no taxpayer-funded subsidies. Well, that's a bit true. There are no taxpayer-funded subsidies. The US does provide some subsidies, but they're mainly subsidies on insurance, crop insurance or production insurance, if you like. But why, if there is no difference in the prices, or that the prices are marginally higher than in the US, why is the cost of buying production quota currently set at about $40,000 per kilogram of milk fat per day? This works out to about $40,000 per cow, and without supply management, a dairy cow would normally cost about $3,000. So when you're buying cows and you're a farmer, you have to lay out $40,000 to buy a single cow, which is pretty darn expensive. If we look at whole milk retail prices between 1995 and 2017 in terms of Canadian price per liter, we see a diverging trend where Canadian prices are much higher than they are in the United States. If we look at the amount that farmers pay, or pardon me, a producer of dairy, a dairy producer would have to pay to get extra quota, we see that the quota price and the amount of trade in quota, so the red line is the amount of quota that is bought and sold on the market, and the black line is the price that you have to pay. Notice that the price was fairly low here during the period up to about January 2010, and then it spiked, and it's remained up at around $25,000 for Canada since that time. And I've been trying to figure out why that's been the case. If we look specifically at Ontario, we see that there's some upward trend here in the free market price of quota, and then the price was suddenly set by the marketing board in Ontario. And remember, this is not just an Ontario scheme, this is a scheme across all of Canada. So what caused this price spike that we saw in the previous diagram, because it's not due to Ontario, as we can see here. The reason why there was a spike in the price of quota in Canada related to the change in the way the marketing board in British Columbia, and I think Alberta as well, operated. Prior to 2010, there was a free market in the trade of quota. After that, the marketing board set the quota, and as a result, the price spiked after 2010. We noticed that in Ontario, there was no spike in 2010. That spike was due solely to British Columbia and perhaps to Alberta as well. Those were the two provinces that had a slightly different way of managing the quota. Now, let's look at quota in terms of farm assets. All right, so let's think about land first of all. So what's the value of land? Well, we can look at the producer surplus, which has to cover the fixed cost of land plus a profit. So for a farm, the producer surplus was the non-land fixed cost plus the rental cost of land plus profit. In the long run, of course, that profit, remember how we defined profit, had to be equal to zero, or has to be equal to zero. So the land rental cost is equal to this producer surplus minus that non-land fixed cost. And we can convert the rental cost to purchase cost by capitalizing. The purchase cost is equal to the rental cost divided by interest rate. Now, we haven't gone through that yet, but this is basically a bond formula, and we will consider that in a different. Let's consider a diagram. So here we have our demand function and our supply function. This is the non-land fixed cost, all right? And this is the land rental cost that have to be covered eventually by the producer surplus. Okay, so that producer surplus is used to pay for these fixed costs. If the rental value of farmland is equal to $10,000 per hectare per year, and the rate of interest is 5%, then the purchase price of farmland is 10,000 divided by 0.05, $200,000 per hectare. Now, with supply management, that producer surplus has to cover that non-land fixed cost, plus the rental value of land, plus the rental value of the quota. So the rental value of the quota is the additional producer surplus that's required, and it results from supply management. So then the purchase price of quota is equal to the rental value of the quota divided by the interest rate. If the purchase price of the quota is 40,000 per kilogram per day, then the rental value of quota is equal to 0.05 times 40,000 equals $2,000 per kilogram per day of butterfat. All right, so don't get too confused here with per kilogram per day. This is 1 unit, okay? So this gives you the right to produce a kilogram of butterfat 365 days. It takes about 25 liters of milk per kilogram of butterfat, and so the rental cost is about $2,000 for 25 times 365 equals 9,125 liters of milk per year. This works out to about 22 cents per liter of production. Now, it's subject to a high estimation error, but that's the amount of money that's required over and above the regular price just to cover the quota value to cover the payment that the farmer has to make for quota. So we can treat this supply management regime as a monopolist, although we're not 100% sure that this production quota is determined by the marginal revenue function going through the supply function here. All right. Now the price that the farmer receives is given by P, and the marginal cost of production is equal to the cost of producing milk. And P minus C is the rental cost of the quota. So P minus C is 22 cents per liter of production for each liter. All right. This would be the competitive price of milk. So this amount is an annual rental cost because it is annual. To obtain the value of the quota, we divide the rental by the interest rate, which could be quite high because producers face the risk of the supply management regime being dismantled. All right, and there has been some dismantling of this regime over time. But this is basically the rental cost of the quota. So that's what you and I would have to pay for with the price of milk, which would be 22 cents per liter. The relatively high rental cost of quota implies that the current price of milk with supply management is well above the competitive price. So a higher market value of the production quota implies a higher deadweight loss. Remember, this is the deadweight loss here, due to the economic inefficiency from the supply management scheme because of this production quota. Now, farmers are penalized if they try to produce more butterfat than they're allowed. So often, and I saw one study that suggested that farmers were throwing away maybe on a whole millions of liters of milk, which just didn't seem reasonable because these farmers would produce in the area of their quota. But the quota is very restrictive. It basically prevents farmers from increasing their cow herds. So a dairy producer in Quebec is limited actually in the amount of quota that they can buy in any given year, and as a result it could take them 4 or 5 years to have enough quota together in order to be able to buy a single cow. So that means that their cow herds are probably smaller than they ought to be, and they are unable to achieve economies of size as a result.